So at this point in Aristotle's theory, he believes has established that happiness is the supreme good, and he asserts that happiness is a virtuous activity of the soul. However, he believes that taking happiness as the supreme good, despite all his arguments for it, is simply a platitude. So an account of this is required. And given his commitment to teleology, the view that the universe is goal-oriented, each thing has a function, he believes that humans, as humans, have a function. And so in order to understand our proper virtue, our excellence, we have to understand or know what it is that our function is. Because if we look at an analogy to like an artist or any other profession, that the goodness of any artist or any profession is the function of that particular profession or class, and that's what you use to determine its excellence, or alternatively its failure. Now, he says the same will hold true of humans as humans if we do have a function. And he does offer two analogies, arguments by analogy, to attempt to establish that as humans, we have a function. Not just in terms of, the profession you might happen to have as a human, or a job or a role, but simply being a human gives you a function. And his first analogy is this. He draws a comparison between professions like joiners and shoemakers and human beings. And he asks something of a rhetorical question. Is it likely that joiners and shoemakers have functions and humans have been left by nature as a functionless being? And of course, being a rhetorical question, the implied answer is why no. So if professions like shoemaker has a function, then surely nature would not leave people functionless. Now, this could be seen as possibly a good analogy if you look at nature as providing things, beings with professions and roles, which is kind of an appealing view in some cases. But of course, if you hold the view that nature is not like a thing, but just at best a metaphor, then it'd be kind of odd to see nature as attributing, to us or giving us professional roles. But Aristotle thinks that the analogy is presumably a good one. And like all analogies, it's assessed in terms of the number of similarities, the relevance of similarities, and relevant dissimilarities, as per the argument by analogy we saw earlier in the course. His second argument is this. He draws it can be looked at as either an analogy or a kind of a composition argument. So he contends that our parts, like the eye, the hand, and the foot, and other parts of us, have functions, and he contends, presumably by analogy, that as a whole, the human being would also have a function over and above those. And so, I guess by analogy, since the parts have functions, the whole has a function as well. Again, this could also be looked at as like kind of a composition argument in which, if all the pieces have functions, it would be odd to say the whole thing doesn't have a function. Now, in the case of something that's manufactured, this may seem kind of reasonable because it'd be, if you think of like something like an iPad or other tablet, it would be, or a car, each piece of automobile has a function, and of course the whole thing has a function as well that all these parts, serve. And so, like for example, the coolant system obviously is designed to help keep the engine cool, but the function of the whole thing is to transport us around. Now, this does have a certain appeal, but you could argue that in the case of manufactured things, we do assign it a function, and the question of whether humans have a higher function would seem to rest on whether we do have a purpose, which may be seen as kind of begging the question. There's also, one could bring up the objection that maybe Aristotle is committing what's called a fallacy of composition. And a fallacy of composition occurs when one infers, without justification, that what is true of the parts must be true of the entire thing. To use something of a silly example, if someone inferred that because atoms are very, very tiny, therefore an elephant, which is made of atoms, is also very, very tiny, that'd be kind of a silly example of the fallacy of composition. A less silly example would be like in sports, if someone infers that because each of the players on a team are extremely good, therefore the team as a whole must be good, because there's more to being a team than just being an individually, very skilled player, because they might not work well together. And so, to his satisfaction, he believes that by comparison to professions like shoemaker and joiners, that humans, as humans, have a function, and also because our parts have functions or do things, therefore the whole human being has a function as well. So to his satisfaction, he believes that we have a function. So, assuming that we have a function, the question is then, what is our function? And so what he does is he looks and attempts to see what is it that's special to us, something that's, on his view, unique to human beings. Now, he first considers qualities that we possess. One obvious one is we're alive. But he believes that despite us being alive, that's not our special function, because, as he points out, plants are also alive, and so that can't be our proper function. And so, even though that presumably is one of our functions, it's not our sort of defining or proper function. And so simply, as he says, nutrition and growth would not be part of our proper function. Next, he considers being sentient, that is to say, experiencing things, feeling pleasure, pain, etc. And as he notes, this is something we've got, but is not special to humans, because horses, cattle, and other animals, as he believes, are also sentient on his view. So that is to be excluded as well. So then, what is our special function, our presumably unique quality? And on his view, it's in the rational part. That is something we have that he believes other creatures, animals, and plants don't have. And his definition of human was rational animal. Now, this raises questions about, would any creature that's rational, animal that's rational, therefore be human, even if they were radically different? And Aristotle presumably didn't think a lot about like science fiction-y topics. So what is the rational part going on? Well, he says this has two parts. The first is, as he says, amenable to reason, and the second actually possesses reason and initiates thought. And he believes that the life determined by activity is a life of us humans because it is in the stricter sense. So to sum that up, essentially our proper function is not merely living because other things live. It's not being a sentient being, feeling, etc., because other things do that. It is being rational. That is our proper function as he sees it. So what then is our, because for him, the good of a being is its proper function. And so he infers that our function as humans is an activity of the soul in accord with, or at least implying, a rational principle. And he takes the view that the function of something and the good of something is the same. He uses an example that the function of a harpist is to play the harp, but of course a good harpist is, the function of them is to play it well. So to be good at what one does is to do that well. And he believes that our function as humans is an activity of our soul, which is implying a rational principle. So the function of a good person is to perform these rational, things well and rightly. And this will bring about, our proper excellence. So the good for a human is an activity of the soul in accord with this virtue. He does consider that if there's more than one kind of virtue, then being, good would be the very best and most perfect virtue. He also puts a qualification on it, and namely that you look at this over the span of a lifetime as opposed to, one day or brief space of time, because he thinks that short amount of time cannot make a person blessed and happy. So he's looking at it in the long term. Now, like all virtue theorists, pretty much who do their theory properly, he does address the question of how you achieve this happiness. And he goes through it in a bit of detail, and in the section we'll look at on moral education, we'll see his theory of, in detail, how you get this virtue. So he considers the possibilities of how we can acquire happiness. And he considers perhaps it can be learnt, perhaps it can be acquired by habituation or cultivated in some other way. He considers maybe it comes from divine dispensation. We'll see this later when we look at Aquinas's Christianization of Aristotle's moral view. And interestingly, Aquinas tags in that the highest form of happiness does come from God. But of course, Aristotle's a pagan, doesn't believe in the monotheistic God, so he's not going to have that happen. And then he considers the possibility that it comes through chance. So basically learning, habit, divine dispensation, or just random. So he considers, firstly, divine dispensation, a gift from the gods. And he says, if anything is going to be a gift from the gods, it would be the best thing, which is, for him, happiness. But he essentially says, well, if this is a divine gift, then it doesn't really fall under, moral theory. It falls under another branch of study, presumably, theology or something, its equivalent. Next, he considers study and training. So if happiness is not a divine gift, but acquired through moral goodness and study or training, it is still one of our most divine possessions because it's, the best. It's something divine and blissful. Now, if you can get it through, study or training, then it should be widely shared because anyone who could become good with a little effort could obviously become good. Now, what about chance? Just randomly occurring. You're happy or unhappy based on the vagaries of fate. Now, he gives a teleological argument against this because Aristotle, as we saw, and we talked about his metaphysics, he believes in a teleological universe, that each thing has a function and all things aim towards their particular end. So he believes that it's better to win happiness by study than by chance. And it's natural for nature's effects to be the finest possible. He's working on the assumption here that nature aims at the best, something later picked up by our good dead friend Thomas Aquinas when he argues about both ethics and God's existence. Of course, he puts in God here. And so he infers also that when we're talking about things of the best kind, that what must follow is this. So the crux of his argument is that since happiness is the finest and very best, and it's natural for nature to bring about the finest and best, and that if the most important and finest thing of all were to be left to chance, he says that would be a gross disharmony. As I say, that just wouldn't be right. And so the gist of his argument against it being dispensed by chance is happiness is the best thing. It's better to win it by effort than by chance. And it would just be, crudely put, just wrong if it was random, if people just got happiness or unhappiness totally at random. So he rejects the notion that we get it by chance. So for him, again, happiness is going to be a virtuous activity of the soul functioning, in an excellent manner. And he believes that there are other goods, but these are necessary preconditions of happiness or contribute to it. So this is an argument that'll be basically, I guess, stolen by John Stuart Mill later on when he talks about utilitarianism. And the idea is that happiness is the supreme good. And if people bring up like other goods, like what about this, what about that, the idea is either they're part of happiness or they contribute to happiness. They're a means to happiness. So how do we bring about happiness? Well, he sees, and we'll see much more of this when we talk about his view of moral education, he believes that political science aims at the highest good. And the chief concern of political science is to make citizens good, to imbue them with virtue and the readiness to do fine deeds. And so he believes that the state should exist to make people good. Now, again, it's easy to be cynical about politics and government, especially today, and think of the government as like either being like corrupt or incompetent. And if you are familiar with dystopian fiction about, oppressive states, it's easy to think of the state as, simply lying about virtue. But Aristotle, again, in his writings, he seems to be sincere, thinking that the state should be truly good and should make the citizens good, for real, not like some sort of clever dystopian deception. So how do we tell when something is a virtue? Well, he begins by looking at the concept of excellence. And for him, an excellence enables whatever possesses that excellence to function. And of course, function very well. So he uses a couple examples. The excellence of the eye makes both the eye, what it is to be the eye, and its function good. So an excellent eye would, see and see very well. Similarly, in the case of a horse, the excellence of a horse would make them a horse, but of course a fine horse. And so in the case of humans, our excellence would be something that makes us good and causes us to perform our function very well. So in a way, it's kind of intuitively what we think of as excellence, being that thing and then being very good at that. And so for him, virtue, he means moral virtue. And that's all about our feelings and our actions. Now, as I mentioned, we talked about our good dead friend Confucius. Virtue theorists across, cultures and time and space have this notion of the mean. The idea being that there is excess, too much, deficiency, too little, and a just right. And not surprisingly, I always use the kind of the metaphor of Goldilocks, where Goldilocks breaks into the house of the bears and finds, the first porridge is too hot, the second porridge is too cold, and the third one is just right. And so it's kind of the Goldilocks theory of ethics. You have to find what is, the mean between the two extremes. And as Aristotle notes, we can feel things like fear, confidence, desire, anger, pity, pleasure, and pain, too much or too little. And the too much and too little are both wrong. So we have to attempt to get it right, get it in the mean. So for Aristotle, the objective is to be virtuous. And this leads to the question about how do you know when you are being properly virtuous? And so he develops this notion that he calls the mark of virtue. And the way you tell that you've got the mark of virtue is having feelings, because for him it's about how you're feeling about things, and you've got to meet these 6 conditions he lays out. The first is you have to have the feeling of, say, fear or courage at the right time, on the right grounds, towards the right people, for the right motive, in the right way, and of course, in the right way is to an intermediate degree, the mean. And so that's his conception of the mark of virtue. And we'll look in the near future, very soon, looking at some examples of how this would play out. And so those are the conditions. So it's not just feeling a thing, it's feeling out of those very particular conditions. And so when it comes to our actions, what we're doing, not surprisingly, the mean applies here. There's excess, deficiency, and mean. And of course, for him, the mean is the best. And virtue for him is about actions and feelings. So there's how you feel and what you do. So continuing with the mean, he takes excess and deficiency to be defects and failings. And the mean is what is success. And so virtue is a mean condition because it aims at hitting the mean. Now, to illustrate this, he goes through a variety of particulars, applying the doctrine of the mean to them. And he goes through lots of examples, but rather than, grind through every particular one, let's take as an example the mean in the case of fear and confidence. So if we look at the matter of, whether you're being afraid or whether you're being confident, there's the question of what is the mean? So he takes the mean in this case to be courage. So a person who has excessive confidence, they are rash, and he sees that as like a bad, a bad thing. And we could look at this in terms of like the effects of it. So a person who's excessively confident and is rash would do things that would needlessly endanger themselves and others. They would have too much confidence. Now, on the opposite side, someone who has an excess of fear and a deficiency of confidence would be a coward. They would be too afraid. And of course, that would have bad effects as well, because they would be afraid of things they shouldn't be afraid of, or be far too afraid of things, out of proportion to the thing invoking the fear. And again, he goes through numerous applications of this. So in the case of pleasure and pain, the mean would be temperance, having, not excessively seeking pleasure. And of course, for him, the excess would be licentiousness, seeking too much pleasure. In giving money, a similar sort of deal, that a person who spends too much would be, giving away obviously too much, and someone who is, too thrifty, kind of like a Scrooge, would be giving away too little. And this applies to every, for him, pretty much actually every feeling and every action. So as a final example, if we look at anger, so the intermediary would be patience, and the mean would be being patient. The excessive person would be irascible, and the vice, irascibility. They would be too angry. And if someone has no anger, he says they would be spiritless and have a lack of spirit. And so we can take every feeling and every action and assign to it a too much, a too little, and a just right. And again, Aristotle goes through lots of examples of this to illustrate his theory, and it all works out, the same way. And each one, of course, has different names associated with excess, deficiency, and just right. So to help us in this, he provides us with a summation and then offers us 3 practical rules for good conduct. So moral virtue, again, for him is a mean between 2 vices. One vice is excess, too much, and the other is deficiency, too little. And again, the Goldilocks theory of morality. And so when we're being virtuous, we aim at hitting that midpoint in both our how we feel and our actions. He does note correctly that it's difficult to be good. And not surprisingly, being a philosopher, he draws an analogy. And he says, finding the midpoint morally is analogous to trying to find the true center of a circle. Because you need to know how to do this, you need to know geometry to do that. And if you know it, then you can find it. Likewise with ethics, you need to have the knowledge to find the midpoint. And as he notes in his example, it's easy to get angry. It's easy to, spend money. But to feel or act towards the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, in the right way, is not easy. And not everyone, can do it. And pretty much probably no one can do it just like all the time, always do that. And he says to do it well is rare, laudable, and fine achievement. So he does believe that being good is difficult, getting all those things right. And that would if he's correct, this would help explain why it's so hard to be good. Because if you're really trying, there's so many variables, so many moving parts that you have to get just right. Now, to help us, as I noted, Aristotle helps us with 3 practical rules that are aimed at assisting us in hitting that midpoint. His first practical rule is this: keep away from that extreme which is more contrary to the mean. And not surprisingly, he draws an analogy. Calypso, who is a Greek goddess of the sea, advises this: far from this surf and surge, keep thou thy ship. And it's basically a nautical reference, essentially, to stay away from in this case surf and surge would be the surf near the shore, because the ship is more likely to wreck up against the shore. And Aristotle believes that one extreme will always be worse than the other. That would be going that way would result in more problems. And so, since it's so hard to hit the mean exactly, you have to essentially err towards the lesser evil. And again, going with the ship analogy, it's being too far out to sea in a ship, especially if we're looking back to, ancient ship technology. You wouldn't want to get too far out to sea because they didn't have things like, GPS and navigation. They had decent navigation, but not like super great navigation like today. So being too far out could be risky. And of course, being too close to shore could be risky too, because you could hit objects, things like reefs or rocks or wreckage. And so if you're kind of unsure, like too far out or too close, in that case, too close to shore is probably more dangerous. And then in the case of feelings and actions, he believes there will always be an extreme that's worse. We could use, for example, anger. In general, in the case of anger, usually it's being excessively angry that's worse. It's rare that you hear someone telling a story and saying, oh yes, and the people were not angry enough and terrible things happen. What you usually hear is people got, really angry and out of control, and then terrible stuff, violence ensued. Similarly, for like generosity, you generally don't hear people say like, someone gave me a gift that was slightly more than I wanted, how terrible that was. And people generally complain about, getting, say, a gift that was less than they expected. And so, one could, of course, be excessively generous and cause people to, see that as being too much. But in general, if you go like a little bit more generous as opposed to more stingy, generally that goes better. Now, there could be, of course, exceptions, but Aristotle does seem right. There seems to be one extreme that's worse than the other. So practical rule 1, since we can't always perfectly hit the midpoint, determine which extreme in that situation is worse. And if you're going to err towards the less bad. Practical rule 2, we must notice errors into which we are liable to fall and drag ourselves in the contrary direction. And Aristotle correctly notices that each person has different tendencies and, different inclinations. So how do you know what your inclinations are? Well, he gives a practical guide here as well. Namely, you determine your tendencies based on the pleasure and pain they give a person. And so we have to know our failings and our weak points and try to, push away from those. And again, he uses an analogy. The way you straighten a piece of wood that's warped is you push it in the opposite direction and kind of lock it into place until the warp hopefully goes out. So for example, if a person is prone to anger and they're aware of that they, initially kind of enjoy that surge of anger, then they would need to be on guard against that and kind of try to keep their anger under control. If someone is prone to being, say, too stingy, they would have to kind of like push against that and push towards generosity. And similarly for all other, feelings and actions. So rule 2, basically know yourself and know which way you tend to be pushed or pulled, and, push or pull against that accordingly. His third rule deals with pleasure, which is this: that we must be on guard, especially against pleasure and pleasant things, because we're not impartial judges of pleasure. We're easily swayed by it. And of course, he brings up a reference to mythology, and he says we should adopt the same attitude that the Trojan elders did towards Helen. And they, of course, warned against keeping Helen because things would go badly. And of course, they did go very badly for the Trojans because you get the Trojan horse, and there we go. So we need to be on guard, according to Aristotle, against pleasure. And if, say, the pleasure is luring us to excess or deficiency, then this will help eliminate the attraction, and we're more likely to go right and less likely to go wrong. And of course, what people find pleasurable and pleasant does vary. So, for example, if someone is, finds like being angry and contentious enjoyable, they like that kind of thing, and it leads them to, the excessive anger, they'd want to roll that back. So he thinks that these rules, of course, are not perfect, but they will help us hit the mean, which is, of course, what he's all about. And he does again say this is a very difficult thing. It's not easy to determine what is the right way, for example, to be angry, with whom, on what grounds, and for how long. And this is, hard to sort out, especially when it comes to the emotions, because they often kind of tend to turn off reason. So we sometimes praise people showing deficiency, and sometimes praise those showing excess. For example, in the case of anger, if someone is not angry enough, they might be praised as being patient. And someone who, is acting more angry than they should, they might be praised, to use, Aristotle's kind of sexist term, as being manly. And there is, of course, a high degree of judgment here as to what is too much and too little. And people have different perspectives. Now, he does note that this is difficult again, and if someone misses the mark, a bit, then they're not to be condemned. Again, because it's hard. And if someone goes too far, of course, that's much more noticeable, and they are condemned for this, or often condemned. So his final rule here is that it's not easy to define by rule how long and how much a person may go wrong before they are justifiably blamed. And he thinks this doesn't show that morality is, subjective, but he shows it's just a matter of showing how difficult it is. And he draws an analogy to other objects of perception, and they can be difficult to, to sort out. So the mean, again, he sticks to is to be commended. And sometimes we slide towards excess and deficiency, and we should always try to aim for that mean. But again, he says this is a very difficult thing, and we have to address it in each case very particularly. And he doesn't infer this shows that morality is relative or subjective, just that it's difficult. And again, as we saw before, he really likes strong analogies to medicine, and the fact that medicine is difficult and the same exact treatment doesn't work on everybody wouldn't lead us to say that medicine is all just opinion, just all relative, just all subjective. We would just say it's difficult, and different circumstances require different things. And we'll see more of Aristotle's discussion on how to become ethical, and not surprisingly many more analogies when we talk about his view of moral education. So that concludes our look at Aristotle's virtue theory. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.